The Patriotic Murders, a riveting tale of mystery and intrigue. The story begins in a world teetering on the brink of chaos. Whispers of betrayal and conspiracy snake through the corridors of power, casting long shadows over a nation gripped by fear and uncertainty. Patriotism, once a symbol of unity, has become a dangerous weapon, a rallying cry for loyalty and a cloak for sinister motives. In this volatile atmosphere, a murder shatters the fragile balance. The victim, a high-ranking official, a linchpin of national security. The method, chillingly precise, executed with surgical precision that leaves no doubt about its calculated intent. The nation is stunned, its leaders scrambling for answers as paranoia spreads like wildfire. Enter Hercule Poirot, the legendary Belgian detective renowned for his unparalleled intellect and unshakable determination. Reluctant at first, Poirot is drawn into the case by a desperate plea from an old acquaintance, a figure deeply entwined with the victim. As Poirot surveys the crime scene, his sharp, discerning eyes lock onto details that others dismiss. The subtle arrangement of objects on a desk, a peculiar smudge on the window pane, and a cryptic note that seems to whisper secrets. Monday, Ami. Poirot muses to his trusted companion, his voice tinged with curiosity and gravity. We are dealing with a killer who is both cunning and calculating. This is not a crime of passion, but one of meticulous design. The question is, pourquoi? Why? Thus, the stage is set for an electrifying tale of mystery and intrigue. Every clue peels back a layer of deception. Every revelation sharpens the focus on the truth, and every suspect harbors a motive shrouded in shadows. The chase for justice begins, and Poirot must navigate a labyrinth of lies to uncover a killer who thrives in the dark recesses of power. 2. Rising tension. The killer strikes again. This time, the murder is even more elaborate, the message more provocative, and the fear more palpable. The city is no longer a place of routine and order, but a tense battleground, where every shadow holds the potential for betrayal. Poirot finds himself pulled deeper into a labyrinth of deceit, where the stakes grow higher with each passing moment. The pattern of the murders begins to reveal itself, each victim a seemingly random choice connected to a greater scheme, a hidden agenda that lurks just beyond the surface. Poirot's keen mind works tirelessly, piecing together the fragments of information that point toward a chilling conclusion. Each clue feels like a piece of a puzzle, but the picture they form is still maddeningly incomplete. As the killer's confidence grows, so does their brazenness. A chilling message is left at the latest crime scene, written in bold, deliberate strokes, for the good of the nation. It's a declaration that twists the concept of patriotism into something dark and perverse. Poirot studies the note carefully, noting the peculiarities in the handwriting, the ink smudges, and the paper's texture. Every detail is a potential key to unlocking the killer's identity. The atmosphere in the city becomes suffocating. News of the murders dominates every conversation, and trust erodes rapidly among friends, colleagues, and even families. The tension is palpable as suspicions run rampant. Poirot's presence is both a beacon of hope and a reminder of the grim reality they face. Among the chaos, a new suspect emerges. This individual's connections to the victims are undeniable, but something about their demeanor doesn't sit right with Poirot. Their calmness feels calculated, their answers rehearsed. Poirot watches them intently, his sharp eyes noting every hesitation, every involuntary gesture that betrays their nerves. Still, he knows this might be a distraction, a carefully constructed alibi meant to lead him astray. Poirot's investigation takes him into the heart of the city's most powerful circles. He interviews politicians, military officials and influential figures, all of whom seem to harbor secrets of their own. Each conversation feels like a game of chess, with every question carefully calculated to provoke a revealing response. Poirot's questions cut through the facades, exposing cracks in their stories, but he remains acutely aware that his every move is being watched. The killer's motives begin to crystallize in Poirot's mind. This isn't just about murder. It's about sending a message, reshaping the nation's identity through fear and manipulation. Poirot's determination intensifies. He must not only stop the killer, but also unmask the twisted ideology driving their actions. The pressure mounts as another murder occurs, this one even closer to Poirot's circle. A figure he'd interviewed a witness with a small but significant piece of the puzzle becomes the latest victim. Poirot feels the weight of the loss, the sting of being one step behind the killer. The loss fuels his resolve, pushing him to dig deeper into the web of lies and deceit. As Poirot pieces together the clues, he begins to sense a larger conspiracy at play. This isn't the work of a single individual, but a coordinated effort with far-reaching implications. The realization sends a chill down Poirot's spine. He knows the truth is within reach, but every answer seems to lead to more questions. The killer's endgame remains elusive, their motives shrouded in secrecy. Poirot gathers the suspects, determined to expose the killer among them. In a dramatic confrontation, he lays out the intricate web of evidence, his voice steady and commanding. The room grows silent as Poirot recounts the chain of events, pointing out the subtle clues that only he could see. The tension in the room is palpable, every eye fixed on Poirot as he edges closer to the truth. As the chapter ends, Poirot issues a chilling warning. This game of cat and mouse is nearing its end, but beware, the most dangerous players have yet to reveal themselves. The stage is set for a climactic showdown, where every revelation will bring Poirot closer to unmasking the mastermind behind the murders. 3. Deepening mystery. Hercule Poirot steps into the shadows of a world where truth and deception intertwine like a deadly dance. With every step closer to the heart of the mystery, the layers of political intrigue grow darker and more labyrinthine. This is no ordinary investigation. Behind each clue lies a network of secret alliances, betrayals, and power plays that threaten the fragile balance of the nation. The case takes an unexpected turn as Poirot discovers a cache of coded documents hidden in the home of one of the victims. The papers, meticulously concealed within a hollowed-out book, are a masterwork of encryption, a trail of breadcrumbs leading to an elusive truth. Poirot examines the symbols and codes with precision, his mind piecing together patterns that would baffle even the most astute cryptographer. The revelations point to a covert group operating within the highest echelons of power, their motives concealed beneath layers of secrecy. As Poirot delves deeper, he uncovers shocking connections between the victims. What seemed at first to be unrelated murders now reveal a chilling pattern. Each victim held a piece of knowledge that, when combined, could expose a devastating truth. Poirot realizes he is not just unraveling a murder spree, is dismantling a conspiracy that reaches into the nation's core. The detective's inquiries lead him into dangerous territory. Late one evening, Poirot receives an anonymous tip to meet at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The location, cloaked in darkness and decay, oozes an air of foreboding. As Poirot steps inside, he is met with an unsettling sight. A single, flickering bulb illuminating a table piled with incriminating documents. Before he can examine them thoroughly, a shadow moves, and Poirot narrowly escapes an attack. It's clear someone is watching his every move, determined to keep the truth buried. The political web grows more tangled as Poirot interviews key figures. Ministers and officials, each with their polished veneers, reveal cracks under Poirot's relentless scrutiny. One particularly heated encounter, with a high-ranking official, ends with a chilling warning. "You don't know what you are meddling with, Monsieur Poirot." Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Poirot's sharp mind interprets this not as a threat, but as a confession of guilt. He notes the subtle tremor in the man's hand, and the darting of his eyes, telltale signs of a man grappling with his own duplicity. The trail of betrayal leads Poirot to uncover a hidden alliance between unexpected parties. Secret meetings in the dead of night, encrypted correspondence, and untraceable financial transactions paint a picture of a coalition driven by greed and ambition. These alliances cross political lines, uniting sworn enemies in their pursuit of mutual gain. Poirot's frustration grows as the deeper he digs, the more he realizes the enormity of the forces working against him. The detective begins to piece together the roles of the victims within the grander scheme. Each one had been a gatekeeper of a critical piece of information. A whistleblower on corruption, a journalist uncovering scandal, a bureaucrat preparing to leak damning evidence. Together, they were a threat. Alone, they became targets. Poirot's heart sinks as he realizes the sheer ruthlessness of the conspiracy, a network that eliminates anyone who dares to disrupt its carefully constructed facade. Poirot's investigation grows increasingly perilous. One evening, as he returns to his apartment, he finds it ransacked. Drawers have been overturned, papers scattered, and a warning scrawled across the mirror in red ink. "Leave while you still can." Poirot stares at the message unshaken. "If they think this will deter me, they underestimate Hercule Poirot," he murmurs, his resolve hardening. Despite the danger, Poirot presses on, uncovering a lead that takes him to the opulent estate of a powerful industrialist. The man, seemingly above reproach, is a cornerstone of the conspiracy. Poirot's visit is met with thinly veiled hostility. As he navigates the estate's grand halls, he observes the subtle indicators of guilt. A hastily closed safe, a ledger deliberately left out of view, and a sudden shift in the man's demeanor when confronted with pointed questions. The threads of the mystery begin to converge, forming a chilling portrait of corruption and ambition. Poirot realizes that the murders were not merely a means to silence the victims, but also a massage demonstration of the lengths to which the conspirators are willing to go to protect their secrets. In a dramatic climax to this chapter of the investigation, Poirot sets a trap to draw out one of the key conspirators. At a glittering gala, attended by the city's elite, Poirot maneuvers the players into position, using their own ambitions against them. Under the dazzling lights of the ballroom, the trap is sprung. The evening ends not with champagne toasts, but with the arrest of a figure whose betrayal sends shockwaves through the upper echelons of society. As the chapter closes, Poirot reflects on the complexity of human nature. When greed and power blind the soul, he muses, murder becomes a tool and loyalty a game. But no matter how deep the mystery, the truth will always rise to the surface. The mystery deepens further, but Poirot is undeterred. With every revelation, the stakes grow higher, and the true face of the conspiracy comes closer into focus. Yet the most dangerous secrets remain just out of reach, and Poirot knows the endgame is approaching. His brilliance will be tested as never before, and the nation's fate may hinge on his success. The personal betrayal. As Hercule Poirot delves deeper into the labyrinth of deceit, a chilling twist emerges. Someone intimately connected to the victims is not who they appear to be. A close friend or trusted family member, once thought to be a grieving ally, becomes the nexus of suspicion. The revelation sends shockwaves through the investigation, adding an unsettling layer of betrayal to an already tangled web. Poirot's suspicions begin innocently enough. A casual observation during a meeting with a relative of one of the victims, a faint hesitation in their speech, a sudden aversion to eye contact piques his curiosity. At first, he attributes it to the strain of grief, but as he pieces together seemingly unrelated fragments, a darker picture begins to form. A chance discovery intensifies the mystery. Among the victim's personal effects, Poirot finds an old photograph tucked into a journal. The image shows the victim and their supposed confidant, arm in arm, smiling broadly. But Poirot's sharp eyes catch something others might miss: the faint outline of someone cropped out of the picture. Who was this third person, and why were they removed from the memory? Poirot's inquiries take him to the quiet suburbs where the friend resides. The house, outwardly ordinary, brims with secret. As Poirot observes the surroundings, he notices subtle inconsistencies: the hurriedly closed curtains, the faint smell of smoke suggesting documents recently burned, and the nervous energy radiating from the person before him. Over tea, Poirot gently steers the conversation toward the past. "You were very close to our victim, were you not?" he inquires, his voice light yet probing. The response is immediate but faltering, the carefully constructed facade showing its first crack, a clue that changes everything. As Poirot continues to investigate, he uncovers a hidden correspondence between the friend and another key figure in the case. The letters are cryptic, but reveal enough to suggest a relationship far more complex than mere friendship. Poirot pores over the documents, each word feeding his growing conviction that this person is not just a grieving acquaintance, but a linchpin in the conspiracy. In one letter, Poirot spots a recurring motif: a signature marked with an unusual flourish. When compared against other documents found at the crime scenes, the connection becomes undeniable. The friend had not only been involved but was actively communicating with the victim's and possibly the killer. The web of lies tighten. Poirot arranges a confrontation. Under the guise of seeking further clarity, he invites the individual to a public setting where their reactions can be carefully observed. At a bustling cafe, Poirot plays his cards subtly. He presents fragments of evidence: the letters, the photograph, the cropped-out figure, and watches as his suspect's composure crumbles. Their initial denial is forceful, even indignant. "How dare you insinuate such things?" they exclaim, their voice trembling. But Poirot presses on, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Mademoiselle," Poirot says softly, his piercing gaze locking onto theirs. "When one lies, it is not the words that betray them, but the eyes, and your eyes tell me a story you wish to hide." Caught in the web of Poirot's logic, the suspect stumbles. They admit to knowing more than they initially revealed but stop short of confessing to any crime. Their half-truths only deepen Poirot's determination to uncover the full extent of their involvement. The family connection unveiled. A breakthrough comes when Poirot examines the victim's financial records. A series of unexplained transactions points to a hidden account, one that ties directly to their so-called friend. Poirot deduces that this person had been siphoning funds under the guise of helping the victim manage their finances. The trail of deceit doesn't end there. It leads to a larger plot involving key players in the conspiracy. The most shocking twist comes during a late-night revelation. Poirot receives a package containing an old family heirloom locket belonging to the victim, along with a note written in a trembling hand. "I tried to warn them, but I was too late. Now they'll come for me too." The handwriting matches that of the suspect, but the tone suggests fear rather than malice. Poirot realizes the truth. This individual is not the mastermind, but a pawn caught in the crossfire. Their betrayal, though real, was born out of desperation rather than greed. The final confrontation. Poirot orchestrates a dramatic finale, inviting all key figures to a neutral location. The room buzzes with tension as Poirot unveils his findings. "You believed yourself clever," he says, addressing the suspect. "But in your haste to deceive, you overlooked one simple fact. Hercule Poirot always finds the truth." Piece by piece, Poirot reconstructs the timeline, revealing how the suspect's actions fit into the larger scheme. He exposes the cropped photograph, the financial records, and the coded letters, each one a damning piece of evidence. The room falls silent as the full weight of Poirot's deductions sinks in. In a final twist, Poirot offers the suspect a chance at redemption. "You are guilty of betrayal, yes," he acknowledges, "but you are not beyond saving. Tell us everything you know, and perhaps justice will temper mercy with understanding." Overcome by guilt and fear, the suspect breaks down, revealing critical information about the conspiracy's inner workings. Their confession provides Poirot with the final pieces needed to dismantle the plot once and for all. As the chapter closes, Poirot reflects on the frailty of human nature. Betrayal, he muses, is a knife that cuts both ways. For those who wield it, the wound is often deepest. The mystery, though unraveling, is far from over. With the conspiracy's roots exposed, Poirot knows the most dangerous players remain in the shadows. Yet, armed with new revelations, he steels himself for the battles yet to come. The chase is on, and the game has never been more perilous. The final confrontation loomed over the investigation like a storm waiting to break. Hercule Poirot stood in the heart of the grand drawing room, his mind sharp and unfaltering as always. He had assembled the suspects, each one carefully placed in their designated spot, the shadows of their guilt weighing heavily upon them. They were a mix of high society and military men, their lives intertwined by a delicate thread of duty, loyalty, and patriotism until that thread snapped under the weight of a brutal murder. The truth had been elusive, slipping through Poirot's grasp with every new clue. But now, in the stillness of the room, everything began to fall into place. The motive behind the killings, twisted and personal, was about to be revealed in its full, devastating form. Poirot's gaze swept across the faces of the suspects, each one seemingly holding their breath. It was as though they were all aware of the inevitable, and yet none of them dared to move. There was a quiet, almost imperceptible tension in the air, a buzz that whispered of the darkness they had all tried to hide. The story that had been unfolding before Poirot's very eyes was one of betrayal, manipulation, and a single-minded pursuit of vengeance disguised as a noble cause. At the center of it all stood the killer, someone who had hidden in plain sight, using the banners of patriotism and loyalty to disguise their true motives. The love of their country, which they had so fiercely proclaimed, had been twisted into something dark and personal. Poirot had been patient. He had asked the right questions, observed every detail, and examined the smallest inconsistencies in the suspect's stories. It had all led him to this moment. The killer had made a fatal mistake, slip of the tongue, an unguarded glance at something so subtle, yet so revealing, that Poirot had been able to see through the facade. As the room grew even more silent, he turned to face the one person who had seemed almost too innocent to be involved, the one who had played the part of the concerned citizen, the quiet observer. But now, the final truth was staring him in the face. The murderer's eyes flickered for just a second, the mask cracking. In that instant, Poirot knew he had them. The killer's calm demeanor wavered, replaced by something darker, an unmistakable flash of guilt, mixed with desperation. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the murderer stepped forward, revealing their true intentions to the group. The truth was as shocking as it was inevitable. They had killed not for the ideals of their country, as they had claimed, but for a personal vendetta, one that had festered for years in the shadows of their heart. A betrayal so deep that it had become an obsession, a need for retribution that had clouded their judgment and blinded them to the consequences of their action. The murders had been a means to an end, a twisted form of justice, where the murderer believed they were righting a wrong. They had used patriotism as a shield, a tool to manipulate the emotions of those around them, to rally support and deflect suspicion. But in reality, it had been a mask, a convenient excuse for something much more personal and much darker. The room seemed to hold its breath as the killer spoke, their voice cold but resolute. They had been wronged, betrayed by someone they trusted, and now they had taken matters into their own hands. The deaths of the victims were not just random acts of violence, they were carefully calculated strikes against those who had wronged them, who had cost them something they could never recover. Each murder had been a step in their plan for revenge, a twisted form of justice they believed was owed to them. Poirot listened carefully, his expression unreadable. He had heard many stories in his time tales of heartbreak, betrayal, and revenge, but this one was different. The murderer's sense of justice was warped, their motives so tangled in personal grievance that they had become blind to the greater consequences of their actions. They had been willing to sacrifice everything, even their own integrity, in the name of a misguided, twisted form of patriotism. As the killer spoke, Poirot's mind raced through the puzzle, piecing together the final fragments of the story. It was clear now every move, every action, every calculated decision had been a part of a larger, more sinister plan. The murders were not an act of duty or honor. They were the result of a mind driven by revenge, a mind so consumed by anger and hatred that it had no room for reason or morality. The killer had used the ideals of patriotism as a veil, a mask to hide their true intentions. But Poirot had seen through it all. He had known from the start that this was not a case of honor, but of vengeance twisted beyond recognition. The revelation sent a ripple through the room, shock, disbelief, and finally, a grim understanding. The true nature of the murders had been exposed, and with it, the truth behind the killer's actions. It was a revelation that felt both inevitable and unsettling. The murderer had killed for a cause that was personal, not national, and in doing so, they had warped the very ideals they claimed to uphold. Poirot stood there, unmoving, as the killer's confession echoed in the stillness of the room. His sharp mind had unraveled the layers of deception, exposing the raw, unvarnished truth. The killer's motivations, once hidden in the murky depths of their mind, were now laid bare for all to see, and with that final revelation, the case was closed. But the story didn't end there. For Poirot, the true weight of the case was not in the solving of the mystery, but in the understanding of the human condition, the way in which personal vendettas could twist noble ideals into something dark and destructive. The theme of patriotism, so often revered and upheld, had been shattered, revealing the ugly truth that sometimes the greatest threats to a nation were not external, but internal, born of personal grudges, vendettas, and the dangerous power of a twisted sense of justice. The murderer had sought to restore balance, but in doing so, they had created chaos. They had taken the very thing they claimed to protect patriotism and distorted it into something monstrous. As Poirot looked around the room, he could see the weight of the revelation settling on each of the faces before him. Some were relieved, others were horrified, but all were forced to confront the true cost of the murders. It was a sobering reminder that the pursuit of justice, when driven by personal vengeance, could have far-reaching consequences. With the case solved and the killer unmasked, Poirot's mind turned inward, reflecting on the lesson the story had taught him. He knew that in this world, patriotism could be a powerful force, but when twisted by personal emotions and unhealed wounds, it could become a weapon of destruction. The truth had been revealed, but the consequences of that truth would linger long after the killer was taken away, and that, Poirot knew, was the most chilling revelation of all. The case was finally closed. Hercule Poirot stood in the quiet aftermath, his eyes surveying the room with the sharp, calculating gaze that had guided him to the truth. The murderer had been unmasked, their motives exposed for all to see, but as Poirot lingered over the conclusion, a sense of unease gnawed at him. The mystery had been solved, the killer apprehended, and yet, something about the case didn't feel quite finished. There was a shadow hanging over the resolution, a lingering question that Poirot could not quite shake. The killer's twisted sense of patriotism had driven them to commit heinous acts in the name of loyalty and national pride. But had they truly been in the wrong? Was their warped interpretation of duty so different from the lofty ideals espoused by those who had built the very foundations of the nation? The cost of loyalty had been made abundantly clear in the wake of the murders. It was a cost that had been paid not just by the victims, but by the killer themselves. Their sense of justice, so deeply rooted in personal revenge, had driven them to a place where their actions could no longer be seen as mere acts of retribution. They had blurred the lines between right and wrong, between honor and betrayal, and in doing so, had cast a dark shadow over the very concept of patriotism. Poirot's mind, ever the analytical machine, churned over the complexities of the case. It was clear that the killer had been driven by an intense sense of loyalty to a cause that they believed justified every action, every death, every lie. And yet, as Poirot had uncovered layer after layer of deception, it had become impossible to ignore the fact that the killer's pursuit of justice had been tainted by something more personal, more dangerous than patriotism. It had been fueled by a thirst for vengeance, masked in the rhetoric of duty and honor. But the question lingered: had they truly been wrong in their pursuit? Was it so easy to dismiss their motives as misguided? And, perhaps most unsettling of all, how many others had fallen into the same trap, believing that their actions, however extreme, were justified by a higher calling? The moral ambiguity of patriotism hung heavily in the air, a cloud that Poirot could not dispel. It was easy to claim that loyalty to one's country was a noble cause, a virtue that defined the very essence of a person's character. But what happens when that loyalty is manipulated, twisted into a justification for acts of violence and retribution? What happens when the love of country becomes a weapon, wielded by those who are willing to sacrifice anything, including their own humanity, in its name? Poirot had seen firsthand the devastation wrought by such a twisted version of patriotism. He had seen the cost of loyalty, and it was not a price anyone could truly afford. As the investigation came to a close, Poirot found himself reflecting on the aftermath. The characters who had been swept up in this tragedy, those who had been deceived by the killer's carefully crafted facade, were left to confront the reality of their own involvement. Some had been blinded by their own sense of loyalty, unable to see the darker side of the cause they had championed. Others had been swept along by the tide of nationalism, caught up in the fervor of a movement they believed was righteous. But in the end, they were all left to face the consequences of their actions, realizing that the line between right and wrong had not been as clear-cut as they had once believed. There were no easy answers in the aftermath of the murders. The killer had been caught, justice had been served in the eyes of the law, but the moral questions remained. The complexity of justice itself had been laid bare, and it was a complexity that none of the characters nor Poirot himself could ignore. In their pursuit of what they believed to be right, they had all been forced to sacrifice something. For some, it had been their own sense of morality. For others, their trust in the ideals they had long held dear. And for the killer, it had been their very soul, corrupted by a thirst for vengeance that had ultimately consumed them. Poirot, standing alone in the quiet room, could not help but reflect on the nature of sacrifice. He had spent his life solving mysteries, uncovering truths, but never before had he been confronted with a question as profound as the one this case had posed. How much was too much to sacrifice in the name of loyalty? How far could one stretch the boundaries of justice before they snapped? And, most chilling of all, could the pursuit of justice itself become a monstrous thing, a force that consumed everything in its path, leaving only devastation behind? The resolution of the case had brought no sense of triumph for Poirot. There was no satisfaction in the killer's confession, no relief in the fact that justice had been served. Instead, there was a deep, unsettling sense of ambivalence. The killer had been caught, but at what cost? The nation, the ideals of loyalty and patriotism, had been forever tainted by the actions of one person-owned person who had twisted everything they believed in for their own personal gain. And now, the nation would have to reckon with the consequences of that betrayal, just as the characters involved would have to reconcile with the part they had played in the tragedy. For Poirot, the lesson was clear. The pursuit of justice was never as simple as it seemed. The line between right and wrong was often blurred, especially when emotions, such as loyalty and love for one's country, were involved. He had seen how the noblest of ideals could be warped and manipulated, turned into something dark and destructive. And in the end, the true cost of loyalty, of national pride, was not just the lives lost or the reputations shattered. It was the disillusionment that came when the truth was finally exposed. The realization that the very ideals one had fought for could, in the end, become the catalyst for their own destruction. As Poirot left the scene, his mind heavy with the weight of the case, he couldn't help but wonder how many more would fall victim to the same fatal flaw, that dangerous belief that loyalty, in all its forms, was always justifiable. He had solved the mystery, but the questions it raised would linger, haunting him long after the case had been closed. In the end, the truth had been revealed, but the shadows of moral ambiguity would remain, casting a dark pall over the very concepts of justice, loyalty, and sacrifice.
The room was cloaked in shadows, illuminated only by the dim glow of a single lamp on the mahogany desk. Maria Packington sat hunched in the large leather chair, a half-empty glass of wine cradled in her hands. Her gaze was fixed on a faded family photograph propped up against a stack of unopened letters. In the picture, she and her husband George stood side by side, their smiles radiant and carefree. But that moment, captured so vividly on paper, felt like a relic of another life, a taunting echo of a happiness that now seemed unattainable. Maria's thoughts swirled like the wine in her glass. The house was too quiet now, except for the faint, muffled sounds of laughter from the radio in the other room. George used to laugh like that, she thought bitterly. But lately, his laughter seemed reserved for someone else, Nancy, the young and overly efficient typist who now occupied more of his time than Maria ever could. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the glass tighter, a storm of emotions threatening to burst forth. How had it come to this? Was it her graying hair, the lines that crept onto her face when she smiled? Or had George simply grown tired of her? The questions gnawed at her, each one more painful than the last, leaving wounds that even time couldn't heal. The radio crackled suddenly, breaking through the suffocating silence. A deep, melodious voice filled the room. "Are you happy? If not, consult Mr. Parker Pyne." Maria's brow furrowed, her breath hitching. The words seemed to hang in the air, refusing to be dismissed as mere advertising drivel. She turned her head slightly, listening intently as the voice repeated the message. Happiness guaranteed, it promised. All inquiries treated with absolute confidentiality. The wine glass trembled in her hand, the liquid inside catching the faint light, as if reflecting the tumult within her. Happiness. When was the last time she'd even thought about the word? It felt foreign, like a language she no longer understood, a concept reserved for the young and the naive. Her mind raced with questions. Who was this Parker Pyne? Could he really help someone like her? Or was it just another empty promise designed to lure in the desperate? And yet, she couldn't shake the strange pull of those words as though they had been meant for her, a beacon cutting through the fog of her despair. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windowpane, jolting Maria from her thoughts. She set the glass down with a soft clink and stared at the photograph once more. The smiles looked almost mocking now, a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. The voice on the radio continued, fading into static before being replaced by a cheerful tune that felt out of place, almost surreal against the backdrop of her turmoil. But the seed had already been planted. Maria leaned back in her chair, the flicker of an idea sparking to life in her weary mind. What if? The question loomed large, both thrilling and terrifying. What if happiness was still within reach? What if she dared to hope again? Outside, the laughter on the radio grew louder, mingling with the mournful howl of the wind. The room seemed to darken further, the shadows stretching long and ominous, as if warning her of the risks ahead. Yet, for the first time in years, Maria Packington felt a glimmer of something she couldn't quite name hope, or perhaps the prelude to something far more dangerous. The fading light cast ghostly shapes across the room as Maria whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the wailing wind. "Who are you, Mr. Pyne?" The unconventional savior. Maria stepped into the small but tastefully decorated office, her nerves a tangled knot of anticipation and doubt. The room was unlike any she had imagined. Instead of the clinical sterility of a therapist's office or the imposing grandeur of a lawyer's chambers, this space radiated an understated elegance. Warm wood paneling, plush armchairs, and a single vase of white lilies on a side table lent it a peculiar air of comfort, and yet something about it felt meticulously staged, as though every detail had been chosen to evoke a precise response. "Mrs. Packington, please have a seat," came a voice, smooth and assured. Maria's eyes snapped to the man standing by the desk. Parker Pyne. He was not at all what she expected. His appearance was unremarkable, a stout man in a well-tailored suit, with thinning hair and kind yet unreadable eyes. And yet, there was something about him, an aura of quiet command that made her feel as though she had stepped onto a stage and he was the playwright, already familiar with every line she might speak. She sat cautiously, her fingers clutching her handbag like a lifeline. Pyne settled into the chair opposite her, steepling his fingers as he regarded her with a faint, enigmatic smile. "You heard the advertisement on the radio," he began, his voice calm but probing, as if he already knew the answer. Maria nodded, her throat dry. "Yes. I don't know why I am here, really. It sounded so odd." "Odd," Pyne echoed, his eyebrows lifting slightly. "Not desperate, not intriguing." His words hung in the air, daring her to contradict him. Maria shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, feeling as though he could see past the careful facade she had constructed for herself. Perhaps both, she admitted finally. Pyne's smile deepened, though his eyes remained inscrutable. Desperation and intrigue often go hand in hand, Mrs. Packington. Tell me, what do you want? Maria hesitated. The question was deceptively simple, but the way he asked it made her feel as though her entire future hinged on her answer. I want to save my marriage, she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. Of course you do, Pyne said smoothly, as though her response was both inevitable and irrelevant. But let me ask you this. Are you willing to take the risk? Risk? Maria repeated, startled. What risk? Every solution comes with its own cost, he replied, leaning forward slightly. His tone was gentle, but carried an undercurrent of something darker, a hint of warning. Sometimes it is a small price, sometimes it is more than one is prepared to pay. But nothing worth having is ever truly free. Maria felt a chill run through her. She couldn't tell if his words were meant to reassure her or unsettle her. There was something about him that defied categorization. He seemed kind, even compassionate, but there was a glint in his eyes that hinted at calculation, as though he viewed her not as a person but as a puzzle to be solved. What exactly do you plan to do? She asked cautiously. Pyne's smile returned, mysterious and impenetrable. I have my methods, Mrs. Packington. They are unconventional, yes, but effective. If you follow my instructions to the letter, I assure you, you will see results. Maria's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She wanted to trust him, to believe that he could help her. But there was something in his demeanor, an air of control so absolute that it was almost unnerving. He spoke as though he were orchestrating a grand performance, with her as a mere player in his design. I don't know if I can, she admitted, her voice trembling. I don't even know if I should. Doubt is natural, Pyne said, rising from his chair and moving to stand by the window. He looked out at the street below, his hands clasped behind his back. But let me ask you this. How long can you continue as you are now? How long before the loneliness becomes unbearable? His words struck a nerve, and Maria felt tears prick her eyes. She hated how easily he had seen through her, how effortlessly he had voiced the fears she had tried so hard to suppress. I'll do it, she said finally, her voice shaking but resolute. Pyne turned back to her, his smile returning. Good. Then we begin. As Maria left the office, a strange mix of hope and unease churned within her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a deal with a man who knew far more than he let on, a man who might be her savior or her undoing. Transformation, the game begins. Maria stared at her reflection in the mirror, her heart sinking at the sight. The pale, tired woman looking back at her felt like a stranger. Dark circles clung stubbornly beneath her eyes, her hair hung limp and lifeless, and her shoulders slumped as if weighed down by invisible chains. This was the woman George no longer looked at, the woman whose presence had faded into the background of her own life. But Parker Pyne's instructions had been clear. Trust the process. And so she had reluctantly shown up at the boutique he had arranged, unsure whether to feel hopeful or foolish. The transformation began in a flurry of motion. A stylist with a cascade of auburn curls and an infectious smile ushered her into a chair, declaring, "We're going to bring out your sparkle, darling." Maria wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but the woman's enthusiasm was contagious. As hands worked swiftly, applying creams, trimming her hair, and selecting fabrics with an artist's precision, Maria felt her doubts begin to waver. Each small change brought a ripple of unexpected emotion. When the stylist framed her face with soft waves, Maria glimpsed a version of herself she hadn't seen in years. When a sales assistant draped a deep sapphire dress against her, its rich hue accentuating her eyes, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to feel in ages: pride. "You have such a graceful neck," one of the attendants murmured as she adjusted a delicate string of pearls. Maria blinked, startled. When was the last time anyone had complimented her? The final reveal came with a sense of theater. The stylists and assistants gathered behind her, their smiles eager as they turned her toward the full-length mirror. Maria's breath caught in her throat. The woman standing there was radiant. Her hair shone with vitality, framing a face that seemed to glow with warmth and confidence. The sapphire dress hugged her figure in all the right places, the pearls adding a touch of elegance. For the first time in years, Maria saw herself not as the shadow of the woman she used to be, but as someone vibrant, alive. The emotion hit her like a wave. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of release, of rediscovery. She thought of the years she had spent feeling invisible, of the laughter that had slipped away, of George's indifferent glances that had hollowed her out. And now, here she was, reclaiming the pieces of herself she had thought were lost forever. When she stepped out of the boutique onto the bustling street, the world around her seemed to transform as well. The gray clouds that had hung in her mind felt as though they had parted, revealing a brighter, more vibrant world. Colors seemed sharper, the air fresher, the sounds of laughter and chatter a melody she hadn't noticed before. As Maria walked, heads turned. She felt their gazes, some admiring, some curious, and instead of shrinking away, she lifted her chin, her steps growing steadier with each stride. Confidence, she realized, was intoxicating. It wasn't just the dress or the pearls or the perfect hairstyle. It was the knowledge that she mattered, that she was worth seeing. By the time she reached the small cafe where Parker Pyne had instructed her to meet him, Maria was no longer the woman who had stared forlornly at her reflection that morning. She stepped inside with an air of quiet assurance, her smile as luminous as the chandelier above her. For the first time in years, she felt the intoxicating thrill of being alive, and it was just the beginning. Mysterious Claude entry. The soft hum of violins filled the Grand Hotel ballroom as Maria Packington stood at the edge of the dance floor, her sapphire dress catching the light like ripples on water. She still wasn't entirely comfortable with the transformation that had turned heads all evening, but the thrill of being noticed was undeniable. "May I have this dance?" The voice was deep, smooth, and tinged with an easy confidence. Maria turned to see a man standing before her. His sharp suit tailored to perfection, his dark hair slightly tousled in a way that seemed deliberate yet effortless. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that made her heartbeat quicken. "Claude Luttrell," he said, extending his hand. His grip was warm, firm, and just the right side of lingering. "Mr. Pyne sent me. He thought you might enjoy some company tonight." Maria's cheeks flushed, but she managed a composed nod. "Maria Packington," she replied. His name sounded exotic, like it belonged to someone who had secrets and stories to tell, and Maria couldn't help but be intrigued. As they moved onto the dance floor, Maria felt a surge of confidence she hadn't experienced in years. The orchestra swelled, and Claude led her expertly through the waltz, his touch light but commanding. He leaned in, his voice low. "You've captivated the entire room, you know. But I doubt anyone else here could match your elegance." She laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar yet welcome in her ears. "I think you are exaggerating, Mr. Luttrell." "Claude," he corrected with a wink. "And no, I am not. You are remarkable, Maria. Anyone with eyes can see that." For a moment, she let herself believe him. She felt radiant, cherished, even desired. The evening unfolded like a dreamer's easy charm, the way he seemed attuned to her every word, the way he made her laugh like she hadn't in years. Yet there was something in his gaze, a flicker that she couldn't quite place. Was it admiration, or something darker? They ended the night on the hotel's balcony, the city lights sprawling below them. Maria leaned against the railing, the cool breeze brushing against her skin as Claude handed her a glass of champagne. "You are different from what I expected," he said, his tone softer now, tinged with something that sounded like regret. Maria tilted her head. "What did you expect?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the glass in his hand. The easy charm that had defined him all evening seemed to waver, replaced by an unsettling vulnerability. "Someone untouchable," he admitted. "But you are not. You are real, and that makes what I have to say even harder." The violins inside played a slower, melancholic tune now, as if echoing the sudden shift in the air. Maria's chest tightened. "What is it, Claude?" He set his glass down, his hands gripping the railing as if steadying himself. "Maria, that here is something you need to know about me. I've made mistakes. Big ones. I've lived my life as, well, let's just say I've been paid to be charming. To make women feel special." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. She stepped back, her mind racing to piece together what he was saying. "Are you saying this tonight? Was it all just part of your job?" she asked, her voice trembling. Claude turned to face her, his eyes earnest but shadowed. "It started that way, yes. Parker Pyne hired me to help you, to show you how extraordinary you are. But somewhere along the way, Maria, it became more than that." Her breath caught. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, but so was the sting of betrayal. "How can I believe you?" He reached for her hand, his touch tentative. "You don't have to. All I can say is that you've changed me, and that's not something I've ever experienced before." The music inside seemed to fade into the background as Maria pulled her hand away. She turned back to the city lights, her thoughts a whirl of emotions: anger, sadness, confusion, and something even more dangerous. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of the evening's revelations. "Maybe you have changed, Claude. Or maybe this is just another part of the act. Either way, thank you. Because tonight, for the first time in years, I felt alive." She walked away before he could respond, leaving him alone on the balcony, the weight of his confession lingering in the night air. As she stepped into the elevator, Maria's heart ached with unanswered questions. Was Claude's love real, or just another illusion crafted by Parker Pyne? And did it even matter if, in the process, she had rediscovered herself? Jealous husband encounter. The ballroom shimmered with golden light, the chandeliers casting a warm glow over the polished floor, where couples swayed to the rhythm of a lively waltz. Maria Packington, resplendent in a deep emerald gown that accentuated her newfound confidence, glided across the floor in Claude Lutterell's arms. Her laughter rang out, light and carefree, as he whispered something charming into her ear. For the first time in years, she felt alive, desirable even. George Packington stood stiffly at the edge of the room, a glass of scotch in his hand. His eyes burned as they followed Maria's every movement. Beside him, Nancy, his young and vivacious typist, prattled on about something inconsequential, her hand resting possessively on his arm. But George barely heard her. His focus was entirely on the woman who used to fade into the background of his life but now commanded the room's attention. "She looks different," Nancy remarked, her tone laced with an undercurrent of annoyance. George didn't respond. His jaw tightened as he watched Claude lean in, his face too close to Maria's for comfort. The way she smiled at him, the way she seemed to glow under the ballroom lights, sent a wave of something unfamiliar coursing through him. Was it jealousy? Regret? He couldn't tell, but it was unbearable. As the music swelled, Maria and Claude spun past George and Nancy. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met. Maria's gaze lingered, steady and unflinching, before she turned back to her partner, her lips curling into a smile that felt like a challenge. George's grip tightened around his glass. "I need some air," he muttered, brushing past Nancy and striding toward the exit. The confrontation came later that night, in the quiet tension of their living room. Maria's gown still shimmered under the dim lights, a stark contrast to George's disheveled appearance. He had been pacing, his tie loosened, and his face flushed with anger. "What the hell was that?" he snapped, breaking the silence. "Dancing with that man, laughing like a schoolgirl. Are you trying to humiliate me?" Maria's response was calm, almost detached. She walked over to the mantel, adjusting a vase of fresh flowers, as though his outburst were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Humiliate you?" she echoed, her voice smooth and measured. "Tell me, George, how does it feel?" He froze, caught off guard by her tone. "What's that supposed to mean?" She turned to face him, her eyes piercing. For years, I've watched you parade around with Nancy, acting as though I didn't exist. You didn't care how I felt then, so why do you care now?" George opened his mouth to retort but found himself at a loss. Maria's gaze held him in place, her calm confidence disarming him in a way he hadn't anticipated. "I wasn't trying to humiliate you," she continued, her voice softening but losing none of its strength. "I was simply enjoying myself, something I haven't done in a very long time." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. George sank into a chair, the fight draining out of him. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time in years. This wasn't the timid, mousy wife he had grown accustomed to. This was a woman reborn, radiant and self-assured. "Maria," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. But she held up a hand, silencing him. "Good night, George," she said simply, turning on her heel and leaving the room. As the door clicked shut behind her, George was left alone with his thoughts. The image of Maria's smile, the sound of her laughter, and the sight of her dancing with another man played on a loop in his mind. For the first time he realized what he had taken for granted, and for the first time he felt the sting of being left behind. Shocking confession, Claude. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet park where Maria and Claude walked side by side. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of blooming jasmine, but Maria barely noticed. Her heart was light, a sensation she hadn't felt in years, and it was all because of the man walking beside her. Claude's laughter had a way of filling the silence between them, his charm effortless and intoxicating. He spoke of art, of music, of places she'd never been but now longed to see. With him, Maria felt seen, heard, alive. Yet tonight, there was something different about him. His usual breezy confidence was replaced with a quiet tension that Maria couldn't quite place. "Claude," she said softly, halting their stroll. The moonlight danced in her eyes as she looked up at him. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the cobblestones beneath their feet. For a moment, the man who always had the perfect words seemed utterly lost. Then he exhaled, the sound heavy with resignation. "Maria," he began, his voice low and rough around the edges. "Here is something you need to know about me, something I should have told you from the start." Maria's heart fluttered, but not with the usual excitement Claude stirred in her. This was different. There was a weight in his tone that sent a shiver down her spine. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she had never seen before. "I haven't been honest with you about who I am," he confessed. "Before I met you, my life was complicated. I wasn't always the man you see now." Maria's brow furrowed, confusion mingling with a creeping sense of dread. "What do you mean?" Claude stepped closer, his hand brushing hers, as if seeking solace in her touch. "I used to be a gigolo, Maria," he said, the words tumbling out like stones. "I made a living by entertaining wealthy women, offering them companionship in exchange for money. It wasn't something I was proud of, but it's who I was." The world seemed to tilt beneath Maria's feet. She stared at him, struggling to reconcile the man she had come to trust and admire with the one he was describing. "Why are you telling me this now?" she managed, her voice trembling. Claude's expression softened, his eyes searching hers. "Because you deserve the truth. You deserve better than me. I can't let you build your happiness on a foundation of lies." Maria's breath hitched as the realization hit her. "You are leaving, aren't you?" He nodded, pain etched into every line of his face. "It's for the best. You've come so far, Maria. You don't need me to feel alive. You are stronger than you think, and I won't let my past taint your future." The silence that followed was deafening. Maria felt a storm of emotions raging within her: betrayal, sadness, and an ache she couldn't quite name. Yet beneath it all, there was something else: clarity. "Did you ever care about me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Claude's hand reached for hers, and for a moment she let him take it. "More than you'll ever know," he said, his voice breaking. "That's why I have to go." The confession lingered in the air long after Claude walked away, his silhouette swallowed by the shadows of the park. Maria stood there, her heart heavy but her mind strangely clear. For all the pain his words had caused, they had also given her something she hadn't expected: a sense of self. Later, she would learn the truth: that Claude's confession had been orchestrated by Parker Pyne, a final act in his elaborate plan to ensure Maria found her worth not in the affections of a man, but in herself. Yet in that moment, as she turned to leave the park, Maria didn't need to know. All she knew was that she was no longer the woman she used to be. The stars overhead seemed brighter somehow, their light cutting through the darkness, and as Maria walked away, she felt an unfamiliar sensation blooming in her chest. Not heartbreak, not despair, but something far more profound: resilience. Climactic reunion, George. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Packington residence, casting a warm golden glow over the freshly polished floors and carefully arranged furniture. George Packington sat in his study, staring blankly at the letter he had written and rewritten a dozen times. The words on the page blurred together as memories of Maria flashed through his mind: her laughter, her quiet strength, and the way she used to light up a room. He had taken it all for granted. Last night at the ballroom, something inside George had shifted. Seeing Maria with Claude, her face alight with a confidence and joy he hadn't seen in years, had sent a jolt through him. It wasn't just jealousy, it was regret, a deep, gnawing regret, for the way he had let their marriage crumble. For the first time, he saw her not as his wife, the woman he had grown used to, but as a person with dreams, desires, and a life outside of him. George's grip tightened around the pen as he scrawled a single line at the bottom of the letter. "Maria, I am sorry." It wasn't enough, he knew, but it was a start. In the dining room, Maria was arranging a vase of fresh lilies. Her movements were deliberate, almost meditative, as she placed each flower with care. She had slept soundly for the first time in months, her dreams free of the turmoil that had once plagued her nights. Pyne's words echoed in her mind: "Happiness is not given, it's claimed." She had claimed hers, and for the first time she felt whole. When George entered the room, she didn't flinch or shrink back as she might have before. Instead, she looked up and met his gaze with steady eyes. He hesitated, his usual air of authority replaced with an unfamiliar vulnerability. "Maria," he began, his voice low and uncertain, I owe you an apology." She raised an eyebrow, her hand still cradling a lily. "Do you?" Her tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, a strength he hadn't expected. George swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her scrutiny. "I've been a fool. I let my pride and my selfishness blind me to what really matters. Seeing you last night, so radiant, so alive, it made me realize how much I've lost, how much I've taken you for granted." Maria set the lily down and folded her arms. "And what exactly do you want from me, George? Forgiveness? A second chance? Why now?" Her questions were direct, cutting through the air like a blade. George's shoulders sagged under their weight. "I want to make things right," he said. "Not because I feel obligated, but because I care about you, Maria. I always have. I just forgot how to show it." Maria studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, filling the room with an almost palpable tension. Finally she spoke, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "George, I've changed. I am not the woman who waited in the shadows for you to notice her. I've found my own light now, and I won't let anyone dim it again, not even you." George nodded slowly, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "I understand, and I don't want to dim your light, Maria. I want to be worthy of it." Her lips curved into a small, bittersweet smile. "That's a start." As they stood there, the sunlight streaming between them, the moment was charged with unspoken possibilities. It wasn't a sweeping declaration of love or an instant reconciliation. It was something more fragile, but perhaps more real, the tentative first step toward rebuilding what had been broken. In the background, the faint strains of a melody drifted in from the radio, a tune about second chances, and the courage to begin again. Maria turned back to her lilies, her movements calm and deliberate, as George stood watching her with a newfound respect. For the first time in years, their home felt less like a battleground and more like a place where hope could take root. Closing twist. Pine note. Weeks had passed since the grand transformation of Maria's life. The quiet suburbs were once again filled with the sounds of morning routines, chirping birds, rustling newspapers, and the hum of distant chatter. Maria, seated by the large bay window, sipped her tea with a serenity she hadn't known in years. George sat across from her, buried in his newspaper, but there was something new in the air between them. A kind of respect, a silent acknowledgement of a bond rekindled. As she flipped through her own paper, her eyes caught a familiar name. It was a small entry tucked into the personal column, yet it stood out like a beacon. To the woman who reminded me of my worth. Thank you, I've chosen a new path, Claude. Maria's breath caught. A faint smile touched her lips, but it wasn't one of triumph or longing. It was one of understanding. Claude's words were as much for her as they were for himself. She folded the paper, setting it aside, her thoughts drifting back to Parker Pyne. His name, his presence, his uncanny ability to see through the veils people wore. How much of this her reconciliation, her newfound confidence, her clarity was her own doing, and how much of it was his orchestration? She glanced at George, who had lowered his paper and was watching her. "What is it?" he asked softly, his tone uncharacteristically tender. "Nothing," Maria replied, though her mind was racing. George was here, present, and willing to try. But the cracks of the past still lingered, faint. She wondered if they could ever truly bridge them, or if they had only found a way to paper over. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Maria found herself holding the business card Parker Pyne had given her. The embossed letters gleamed. She turned it over, noticing for the first time, "Happiness is a puzzle, Mrs. Packington. The pieces are yours." A chill ran down her spine, not from fear but from the weight of his words. She looked out the window, half expecting to see him standing there, watching with that knowing smile. But in a modest office across the city, Parker Pyne leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. "Another happy client," he murmured, though his eyes held a glint. Was it pride, amusement, or something darker? Even he might not have. The camera pans back to Maria, who sits by the window with the card still in her hand. Her expression is thoughtful, her smile. The room feels warm, inviting, but the air carries a Was this happiness truly hers, or had it been? The scene fades to black as Maria whispers, "Happiness, do we create it, or does someone else?"
The room carried the weight of old money, with its high ceilings and mahogany paneling, as though the very walls were eavesdropping on the chaos within. The air was thick with the scent of cigar smoke and uneaten hors d'oeuvres, left untouched by trembling hands. Family members who only ever gathered for carefully orchestrated holiday dinners or meticulously curated celebrations now filled the grand drawing room, their faces pale and taut. Elias Hartmann, the indomitable patriarch, the man who had clawed his way from nothing after the war to build an empire that sprawled across industries, was dead. Not in the slow, predictable way men of his age often succumbed, but suddenly, shockingly, in a manner that demanded answers. And answers were in short supply. Rumors were already swirling, faster than anyone could put them down. Heart attack, poisoning, foul play, each theory more sinister than the last. His death had left a vacuum, not just of power, but of certainty. Elias had been the anchor of the Hartmann name, a symbol of stability in a world that seemed to shift beneath their feet after every passing decade. Without him, the foundation felt cracked, and for the first time, the vultures, both literal and figurative, circled overhead. At the head of the room, the family lawyer, Mr. Harrow, stood like a reluctant executioner, his hands clutching a thick folder that held the keys to a future no one in the room was prepared for. The Hartman siblings, Daniel, the eldest and Elias's intended heir, Victoria, the sharp-tongued socialite, and Peter, the youngest, whose reckless spending had always been a sore point. All sat in a tense row, their gazes bouncing between one another like ticking time bombs. And then there was Evelyn, the eldest grandchild and Elias's shadow, who had been closer to him than even his own children. She sat apart, her arms crossed tightly, her expression unreadable but her eyes blazing with a storm that threatened to escape. The moment had arrived. Harrow cleared his throat, the sound reverberating through the room like a gunshot. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering on such short notice. I know this is a difficult time for all of you. Difficult? The word felt absurdly small for what was happening. As you know, Mr. Hartman left very specific instructions regarding the execution of his will. Per his wishes, I'll proceed to read it in full. A collective breath was held as Harrow opened the folder and withdrew a stack of papers. His hands trembled, though whether from age or the weight of the moment, no one could tell. I, Elias Montgomery Hartman, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. The formalities droned on, each line heightening the tension in the room. The Hartmans were not strangers to inheritance or its implications, but this time something felt different. Ominous. The initial allocations were unsurprising. A trust for the grandchildren, minor gifts to distant relatives and staff. But when Harrow reached the portion concerning the bulk of Elias's estate, the air grew thick enough to choke on. To my son, Daniel Hartman, I leave control of Hartman Holdings, contingent upon— Harrow hesitated, his voice faltering, contingent upon his ability to work alongside the executor of my estate, Miss Eliza Crane. The name fell like a grenade, its detonation immediate and all-encompassing. "Who the hell is Eliza Crane?" Daniel's voice, always so measured and authoritative, cracked with disbelief. Harrow didn't answer. He didn't have to. The sound of heels clicking against the marble floor turned every head toward the doorway. There she stood, a woman draped in black from head to toe, a lace veil obscuring her face but failing to hide the confidence in her stride. She moved with a calm authority, as though she belonged here, as though she had always belonged. "I am Eliza Crane," she said, her voice smooth as silk, but with an undercurrent of steel, "and I was Elias Hartman's wife." The room erupted into chaos. Victoria's wineglass shattered against the floor as she shot to her feet. "His what?" she spat, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling with fury. "This is some kind of sick joke." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her sharp mind already piecing together fragments of conversations and moments she'd dismissed before. Peter, ever the instigator, leaned back with a smirk, the wheels of mischief already turning. But it was Daniel who commanded the room's attention, his voice cutting through the cacophony like a blade. "You're lying. My father would never—" His words faltered as he glanced at Harrow, desperate for confirmation. Harrow cleared his throat again, the flush creeping up his neck. "Mr. Hartman and Miss Crane were legally married 2 years ago. I have the documentation here." He held up a notarized certificate as though it were a shield against the fury blazing in Daniel's eyes. 2 years? Victoria scoffed. 2 years and not a word? Not a photo? Not even a mention? Do you expect us to believe that? Eliza Crane stepped further into the room, her gloved hands clasped before her. "Elias valued his privacy," she said simply. "Our relationship was unconventional, perhaps, but no less real." "Unconventional?" Evelyn's voice cut through, low and measured, but with an edge that hinted at the fire beneath. That's an interesting word for what this looks like. Convenient might be more accurate. Eliza turned to her, and for a moment, the veil shifted just enough to reveal the faintest curve of a smile. "You must be Evelyn," she said. "Elias spoke of you often. He said you were the only one in this family with any sense." The jab landed, sparking a fresh round of outrage, but Evelyn didn't flinch. She leaned back in her chair, her sharp gaze locked onto Eliza like a predator sizing up its prey. "I'll take that as a compliment," she said coolly. "But don't mistake my intelligence for naivety. Whatever game you think you're playing here, you've already lost." Eliza's smile widened. "We'll see." As the argument spiraled into chaos, Harrow raised his hands, his voice strained but firm. "Enough. This is not the time or place for—" He paused, glancing nervously at Eliza. "For accusations. The terms of the will are clear, and they stand. If you wish to contest them, you'll have to do so legally." "Oh, don't worry," Daniel said, his voice icy. "We will." But even as the room buzzed with threats and indignation, one thing was clear. Eliza Crane had set foot in their world with a purpose, and she wasn't leaving without a fight. As secrets and alliances began to unravel, it was only a matter of time before the truth behind Elias Hartman's death and his final cryptic decision came to light. And by then, it might be too late for any of them to escape the inheritance trap. The following day, as the Hartman family nursed their collective fury and confusion, Evelyn found herself restless. The events of the previous evening played on a loop in her mind, each word and glance from Eliza Crane twisting like a knife. The pieces didn't fit, and Evelyn had never been one to leave a puzzle unsolved. That's when the idea struck her. Hercule Poirot. The famed Belgian detective had been making waves in the elite circles of New York society, solving cases that seemed impossible to unravel. Evelyn had met him once at a gala. A brief introduction, but one that left an impression. He was meticulous, sharp, and above all, discreet. If anyone could uncover the truth about Eliza Crane and the circumstances of her grandfather's death, it was Poirot. Evelyn wasted no time. By mid-afternoon, she was seated in a modest but impeccably organized office in the heart of Manhattan. Poirot sat across from her, his small, rotund figure almost swallowed by the grand chair, but his piercing gray eyes left no room for doubt about his presence. He listened intently as Evelyn recounted the events, his fingers steepled and his famous mustache twitching as she spoke. "Monsieur Poirot," Evelyn concluded, her voice steady but imploring. "Something about all of this feels wrong. My grandfather's death, this sudden will, Eliza Crane, it doesn't add up. I need your help to find the truth." Poirot leaned back, his gaze never leaving hers. "Mademoiselle, you have painted a picture most intriguing," he said, his French-accented voice calm but deliberate. "A family divided, a fortune at stake, and a mysterious widow who appears from the shadows. It is a story full of the passions and the betrayals, no? But tell me, what do you seek? Justice, revenge, or merely the assurance that you are correct?" Evelyn hesitated, the question catching her off guard. "I want the truth," she said finally, "whatever it may be." Poirot's eyes softened, and he nodded. "Then, mademoiselle, I shall take your case. But you must understand, the truth is often like a blade. It cuts both ways. Are you prepared for what it may reveal?" Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "I am." With that, Poirot stood, his movements deliberate as he retrieved his coat and hat. "Then let us begin. We shall start with the widow, this Eliza Crane. Her secrets will not remain hidden for long." As Evelyn followed him out of the office, a glimmer of hope sparked within her. The wheels were now in motion, and with Poirot's brilliance guiding the way, she was certain the truth would soon come to light. But she could not have anticipated the depth of the shadows they were about to uncover, or how close those shadows would come to consuming them all. The late afternoon sun filtered through the heavy drapes of the Hartman estate's drawing room, casting long, slanted shadows across the floor. Despite the grandeur of her surroundings, Eliza Crane appeared unnervingly at ease, her presence as polished as the fine china on the coffee table. Draped in a sleek black dress that fit her like a second skin, she radiated an effortless elegance, her every movement deliberate and precise. Her gloved fingers toyed idly with the rim of a teacup, as though she had not just upended the lives of one of the city's most powerful families. Yet, beneath her poised exterior, Poirot saw cracks that no amount of charm could conceal. The family had been quick to scatter after the revelation of the will, each retreating to their corners to lick their wounds and plot their next moves. All except for Eliza. She had claimed her place in the center of the storm, as if daring anyone to challenge her. But she had not anticipated Hercule Poirot. "Madame Crane," Poirot began, his voice smooth and measured, carrying the faint lilt of his French accent. "You must forgive my curiosity, but I am a man who thrives on details. And your story, madame, it is, how shall we say, one of remarkable intrigue." Eliza's lips curved into a faint smile, her eyes, a striking shade of emerald, meeting Poirot's without hesitation. "I imagine it must be, Monsieur Poirot," she replied, her tone even. "Alias was a man of remarkable influence. It's only natural that his choices and his past would draw scrutiny." "Ah, but it is not Elias's past that fascinates me, madame. It is yours." Poirot leaned forward, his sharp gaze never leaving hers. "Tell me, how did you and Mr. Hartman come to meet?" She hesitated for the briefest moment, so fleeting that most would have missed it, but not Poirot. He caught the flicker of hesitation in her eyes, the subtle tension in her posture. "We met at a charity gala in Paris," she said smoothly. "I was working as an art dealer at the time, and Elias was looking to expand his collection. We found we had much in common." "An art dealer in Paris," Poirot repeated, nodding as though impressed. "How delightful. And yet, madame, I could not help but notice that your accent is not Parisian. It is, if I am not mistaken, American." Her smile didn't falter, but Poirot detected the faintest tightening of her jaw. "You're very perceptive, Monsieur Poirot. Yes, I was born in Chicago, but I've spent much of my life abroad. My work took me all over Europe." "Fascinating," Poirot said, steepling his fingers. "And yet, when I inquired with several galleries in Paris, none seemed to recall an art dealer by your name." The room seemed to grow colder, the silence heavy with tension. For the first time, Eliza's composure wavered. It was subtle, a faint flush rising to her cheeks, the slightest shift in her gaze, but it was enough. "Perhaps they have forgotten me," she said, her tone still even but now tinged with defensiveness. "It has been many years, after all." "Perhaps," Poirot allowed, though the skepticism in his tone was unmistakable. "And yet, madame, your story is one that leaves many questions unanswered. For instance, why did you and Mr. Hartman choose to marry in secret? A man of his stature, keeping such a significant event hidden, it is most unusual. Elias valued his privacy," she said firmly. "He didn't want the media intruding on our lives. Our relationship was ours, and ours alone." "A noble sentiment," Poirot said, inclining his head. "And yet, madame, secrets have a way of coming to light. Tell me, were you aware of Mr. Hartman's will before his passing?" Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation breaking through her facade. "Of course not. I was as surprised as anyone." "Surprised? but not shocked," Poirot observed, his voice soft but cutting. "You did not protest when your name was announced as executor, nor did you express disbelief at the extent of your inheritance. Most would have been overwhelmed, but you, madame, seemed prepared." "I'm not sure what you're implying, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice cooling. "But I assure you, I had no knowledge of Elias's intentions. I am simply honoring his wishes." "Ah, of course," Poirot said, leaning back with a small, enigmatic smile. "But tell me, madam, do you always honor the wishes of those who trust you, or only when it suits your purpose?" Her composure cracked then, the icy mask slipping just enough to reveal the fire beneath. "I think this conversation has gone on long enough," she said, rising to her feet. "If you'll excuse me, I have other matters to attend to." "Of course, madame," Poirot said, rising as well and bowing slightly. "But do remember, the truth, it has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it is buried. And I, Hercule Poirot, am most adept at unearthing it." Eliza Crane swept from the room, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Poirot watched her go, his expression thoughtful. There was more to this woman than met the eye, and he intended to uncover every layer. As he turned back to the empty drawing room, his sharp mind was already piecing together the puzzle, the image growing clearer with every passing moment. Eliza Crane's secrets would not remain hidden for long. The Hartman estate, for all its grandeur, was a mausoleum of secrets, its opulent halls echoing with whispers of betrayal and hidden shame. As Hercule Poirot delved into the family's history, he began to peel back the layers of deception that had been carefully constructed over decades. The polished facade of wealth and respectability crumbled under his scrutiny, revealing the tarnished truths beneath. Each discovery was a thread in a tangled web, and Poirot, with his unerring precision, was determined to unravel it. It began with Elias Hartman's eldest son, Frederick, whose steely demeanor masked a vulnerability he desperately tried to hide. Poirot's inquiries led him to an abandoned correspondence, a series of love letters hidden in a dusty attic chest. They told the story of a forbidden romance, one that ended abruptly when Frederick's lover disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The timing, Poirot noted, coincided suspiciously with the patriarch's rise to prominence. What lengths, Poirot wondered, would a father go to in order to protect his family's reputation? Then there was Lillian, Elias's younger sister, a woman of impeccable poise and an iron will. Her past, however, was anything but pristine. Financial records unearthed by Poirot hinted at a near-catastrophic investment failure years prior, one that could have plunged the entire family into ruin. Miraculously, the debts vanished overnight, but at what cost? Poirot's relentless questioning revealed whispers of a deal struck in desperation, a transaction that left Lillian indebted to a shadowy figure with ties to organized crime. The implications were damning, casting her loyalty and intentions into doubt. The youngest Hartman sibling, Vivian, was no less enmeshed in the family's dark history. Behind her delicate beauty and soft-spoken demeanor lay a cunning mind. Poirot discovered that Vivienne had been siphoning funds from the family trust for years, funneling the money into offshore accounts. Her reasons, she claimed, were noble: to escape the suffocating grip of her family's expectations and carve out a life of her own. But Poirot saw through her justifications. Greed, he knew, often wore the guise of independence. Yet the most damning revelations came from the matriarch herself, Margot Hartman. Poirot's meticulous research unearthed an old scandal buried deep in the family's archives. Margot, it seemed, had orchestrated a cover-up decades ago to protect her husband's legacy. A business rival, poised to expose Elias's less-than-ethical dealings, vanished under suspicious circumstances. The official story was an accident, but Poirot's inquiries painted a far more sinister picture. Margot's quiet authority took on a darker hue, her motivations murky and fraught with desperation. Each revelation added a new layer of complexity to the case, transforming every family member into a potential suspect. Greed, revenge, and survival. The motives ran deep, entwined in the fabric of their lives. The Hartman family's unity, once their greatest strength, now appeared to be their undoing. Poirot's mind worked tirelessly, piecing together the puzzle, each clue bringing him closer to the truth. In the shadows of their shared history lay the answers he sought, and Poirot, ever vigilant, would not rest until every secret and scandal was unveiled. The clock ticked louder than ever in the grand estate of the late patriarch. The chill of the evening set an eerie tone as Hercule Poirot, renowned for his ability to see through the veil of deception, carefully orchestrated the gathering of the family. There was no need for grand speeches, no need for dramatic gestures. He would let the truth speak for itself. The moment had arrived for the culmination of everything he had worked toward, every thread of suspicion that had slowly tightened around the widow and the family, every hidden motive that had been carefully hidden behind pleasant faces and polite words. Poirot knew that tonight would change everything. The truth, as it always does, had a way of finding its light. But the method through which Poirot would expose it was not just about revealing facts. It was about creating an environment where each person involved would have no choice but to confront the lies they had lived by for so long. As dusk fell over the sprawling estate, the family members began to arrive, unaware that they were about to be drawn into a web of revelations they never saw coming. The widow, the supposed grieving widow, arrived first. She was dressed in the finest black lace, her expression one of quiet sorrow. She had carefully cultivated the image of a woman devastated by her husband's untimely passing, a picture of perfect widowhood. But Poirot knew the truth behind that serene mask, the carefully maintained facade of innocence that masked something much darker. The children trickled in, their faces a mixture of grief and guilt, each hiding something, each with a secret they dared not expose. The eldest son, who had always appeared to be the dutiful heir, walked into the room with the same confident stride that had long earned him the approval of his father. But Poirot could see the cracks in his facade, the slightest flicker of doubt that betrayed a deeper knowledge of the family's past. The younger daughter, quiet and reserved, entered the room last. Her eyes, too, were clouded with uncertainty, but there was something in her that made Poirot pause, a sense of hidden guilt that she was trying to suppress. It wasn't the grief one would expect from a daughter mourning the loss of a father. It was something else, something darker, and Poirot, with his unmatched eye for detail, was quick to see the signs. The entire family, united by blood but divided by secrets, stood in the same room under the watchful eyes of Hercule Poirot, who seemed to observe every detail, every movement. He said nothing for a moment, simply watching them, knowing that this was the calm before the storm. And then, when the time was right, he spoke. Poirot's sharp gaze never left the widow. She stood with an air of dignity, as though her grief were enough to shield her from suspicion. But Poirot knew better. He had already spent days piecing together the fragments of the truth, each revelation more startling than the last. Her sorrow, he knew, was not born of love, but of necessity. The patriarch had not been an easy man to live with, but he had been a man of wealth and influence, wealth that the widow had come to rely on. The inheritance had always been her primary concern, and Poirot could see the way her eyes flickered with a strange mixture of fear and greed when the subject of her late husband's estate arose. Her movements, too, told a different story. the slight tremor in her hands when she reached for a glass of water, the way her gaze darted away whenever anyone mentioned the circumstances surrounding her husband's death. The widow was not as innocent as she appeared, and Poirot knew that her composure was but a thin veneer, ready to crack under the weight of truth. It wasn't just her grief that Poirot questioned. It was her identity itself. Who was she really? What did she truly know about her husband's death? How much of her mourning was genuine, and how much was simply a carefully rehearsed performance? He had seen enough to know that the answers lay hidden beneath the surface of her grief, buried deep within the dark corners of her past. Unraveling the secrets, Poirot turned his attention to the children, his eyes moving from one to the next with the precision of a chess master. Each of them had a role to play in this tragic tale. Each of them had a piece of the puzzle, whether they realized it or not. The eldest son, always so eager to step into his father's shoes, seemed to be the one who had the most to lose. He had inherited his father's ambition and drive, traits that had served him well in the business world. But there was something off about him, something in his eyes that told Poirot he knew more than he was willing to admit. He had always been the perfect son, the one who had everything going for him. But had he been involved in his father's death? Had he played a part in orchestrating the circumstances that led to it? The younger daughter, by contrast, was a mystery wrapped in silence. She seemed to be the least affected by the family's turmoil, yet Poirot could sense that she, too, was hiding something. She had always been the quiet one, the one who stayed in the shadows while the others took center stage. But in her silence, Poirot saw a vulnerability that spoke volumes. She had never fully accepted her father's authority, and perhaps she had even resented his control over the family. Could she have been involved in his death, or was she simply caught in the web of her family's lies? Poirot's mind raced as he pieced together the puzzle. Each family member had something to hide, something to gain, and something to lose. But one thing was certain. The patriarch's death had not been a simple accident. It had been a carefully planned scheme, and the widow, as well as her children, were all entangled in it. With the tension mounting in the room, Poirot turned his gaze back to the widow. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. This was it. This was the moment when everything would be revealed. His voice, calm and measured, cut through the silence like a knife. "It is time, madame," Poirot said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. "The truth must be told." The widow's composure faltered, just for a second. The faintest twitch of her lips, a quick glance toward the door, as if considering escape. But it was too late. Poirot had already anticipated her every move. There was nowhere for her to hide now. She remained silent, her lips trembling slightly, but Poirot could see the fear in her eyes. Fear not for herself, but for the truth that was about to come out. Poirot leaned forward slightly, the intensity of his gaze never wavering. "You are not who you claim to be, madame," Poirot continued, his voice steady but filled with authority. "Your past is a shadow you cannot outrun." The widow's face drained of color as the truth began to unravel. The carefully constructed layers of her identity were beginning to crack. She was not the grieving widow, the poor, heartbroken woman she had portrayed herself to be. Her identity was a carefully fabricated lie, and the web of deceit she had spun was unraveling before her eyes. "Your name is not what you claim it to be," Poirot went on, his voice unwavering. "And you were not as innocent as you led everyone to believe. You had a plan to inherit everything no matter the cost." A gasp rippled through the room. The children, who had been silently watching, now turned their gaze toward their mother. The shock was evident on their faces. They had always trusted her. They had believed in her, in her sorrow, in her grief. But now they were forced to confront the truth. The widow's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of fear, of desperation. She had been caught in her own web, and there was no way out. With the widow's secret laid bare, Poirot turned his attention to the rest of the family. The children, their faces pale with shock, looked to their mother, then to each other. The room was heavy with the weight of their collective guilt. "Each of you," Poirot said, his voice now ringing with the sharpness of revelation, "had a part to play. You knew more than you cared to admit, and now you must face the consequences of your actions." The eldest son stepped forward, his jaw clenched in defiance. "You can't prove anything," he muttered. But Poirot's gaze silenced him. "I do not need to prove anything," Poirot replied coldly. "The truth is plain for all to see." The younger daughter, who had been standing in the shadows, now stepped forward, her face a mixture of fear and regret. "I didn't want this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I was afraid." The room was filled with a tense silence, as Poirot allowed the family to come to terms with the truth. The widow, her carefully constructed facade shattered, now stood exposed. The family, once united in their lies, was now torn apart by the truth. There was no going back. The shocking plot behind the patriarch's death had been laid bare for all to see, and in the quiet aftermath, as the family faced the consequences of their actions, Poirot stood as the calm observer, knowing that justice had been served. But there was one more thing to be done, one final act that would bring closure to the case and to the family's tragic tale. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. No longer was it filled with the stifled tension of secrets ready to burst. Now it was filled with a palpable sense of inevitability. The widow's feigned composure had crumbled entirely, her calculated silence shattered by the explosive truth. The family, once united by blood but divided by guilt, stood frozen in shock and disbelief as Hercule Poirot, calm and composed as ever, continued to unravel the final threads of the mystery. The air was thick with the weight of revelation, each word from Poirot cutting through the silence like a blade. With the widow's deception now exposed, Poirot turned his keen eyes to the family members who had been swept up in the storm of lies and greed. The eldest son, who had always projected the image of the dutiful heir, was now visibly trembling. His eyes darted nervously from one person to the next, as if trying to gauge whether they would side with him or condemn him. His father's death, the inheritance, the carefully laid plans to secure his place as the next patriarch, everything was now on the line. The tension in the room was suffocating, but Poirot had already seen through him. The eldest son had played a pivotal role in orchestrating the series of events that had led to his father's untimely demise, but he was not the true mastermind. The real culprit, hidden in plain sight, was someone far more elusive. As the final piece of the puzzle slid into place, Poirot turned his attention to the quiet daughter, whose silence had always stood in stark contrast to her siblings' louder personalities. She had spent her life in the shadows, never quite fitting in, never quite participating in the family drama that had swirled around them. But she had been the one to pull the strings behind the scenes, manipulating her mother, instigating the slow unraveling of the family fortune, and, in the end, pushing the widow to go to drastic lengths to secure the inheritance that would make her the true heir. As Poirot exposed the final layer of deception, the younger daughter's carefully crafted mask shattered. Her face, pale and drawn, revealed the haunting truth. The quiet, docile figure who had been content to observe had been the one driving the family's darkest schemes all along. Her motivations were complex, born of resentment, jealousy, and an unrelenting desire for control. She had watched her father's growing weakness, his diminishing hold over the family, and she had seized the opportunity to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. But now, as Poirot's revelations unfolded, it became clear that her ambitions had pushed her too far. She had crossed a line that could not be undone, and in doing so, she had condemned herself to the same fate as the others, caught in the web of her own lies. The widow's face, once serene and composed, was now a mask of raw emotion, fear, anger, and desperation all mixed together. She had been the one to shield the truth for so long, the one who had spun her web of deceit around the family, using her charm and manipulation to keep everyone in line. But now, with her daughter exposed and the truth laid bare for all to see, she found herself standing at the center of the storm. Her empire of lies had crumbled to dust. Poirot's voice, ever calm, pierced through the chaos. "Madame, it is time to face the consequences of your actions." His words were not accusatory, they were simply the truth. The widow had played her part in the tragedy, a part that had been motivated by her own greed and desire for control over the family fortune. But she had not been the mastermind. That honor, or rather that curse, belonged to her daughter. The widow's guilt was undeniable, but it was a guilt born from a life spent hiding behind a mask of mourning, behind a facade of innocence. She had allowed herself to become complicit in her daughter's plot, and now there was no escape. The eldest son, his pride shattered, stepped forward in a final act of defiance. "You can't prove anything," he spat, his voice laced with bitterness. "This is all just speculation, Poirot. You have no evidence, no real proof." Poirot's sharp gaze never wavered. "Ah, but monsieur, the proof is all around you. You may not see it, but the evidence is woven into the fabric of your family's history. You played a part in this, just as your mother and sister did." His voice grew colder, harder. "The true crime here is not the death of your father, it is the betrayal of everything your family once stood for." The eldest son recoiled, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and fear. The truth was inescapable. He had been a willing participant in the schemes, believing that his position in the family would protect him from the consequences. But now, he saw that there would be no escape from the truth. Poirot stood in the midst of the room, his presence commanding and composed as ever, while the family members around him were left to grapple with their own guilt and the destruction of everything they had once held dear. The tension in the room, though thick and suffocating, began to dissolve as each family member came to terms with the reality of what had transpired. The widow, once the queen of the house, now stood in ruins. The youngest daughter, exposed as the true orchestrator of the plot, had nowhere to run. Her betrayal was unforgivable, and the web she had woven had ensnared not only her family but herself as well. She had sought to take everything, but in the end, she had lost it all. But Poirot, ever composed, never looked back. He had done his part. Justice had been served, and the rightful heir would now walk forward into a future that was free from the shadows of betrayal. This version expands on the final resolution, adding depth to each character's downfall, the shifting dynamics within the family, and Poirot's role in restoring justice. The tension remains high throughout as the family is forced to face their actions, leading to a gripping, emotional conclusion. At the heart of this story are three powerful themes that not only drive the plot, but also explore the complexities of human nature and the consequences of our choices. Through the eyes of Hercule Poirot, these themes unfold with precision and clarity, revealing the deep conflict between personal ambition, family ties, and the pursuit of justice. 1. Greed and its corrupting influence. Greed, often masked as ambition or desire for control, is the silent force that propels the characters toward their ultimate downfall. The story presents how a single desire for wealth and power can distort even the most well-intentioned individuals. What begins as a simple desire for inheritance soon spirals into an all-consuming obsession, infecting the family members and turning them against each other. The widow's manipulation, the eldest son's blind pursuit of status, and the youngest daughter's jealousy all stem from this corrupting force of greed. In their attempts to secure what they believe is rightfully theirs, they lose sight of loyalty, honor, and family unity, showing how greed can blind people to everything else in their lives. 2. Family loyalty versus personal gain. At its core, this is a story about the conflict between loyalty to one's family and the temptation of personal gain. The family, once bound by love and respect, begins to fracture as each member is driven by their own desires. The widow's facade of grief hides a deeper need to claim the inheritance, while the children's motives diverge, with some seeking to benefit from their father's death, and others torn between their moral compass and the pressure of family expectations. The betrayal that slowly unravels among them challenges the very essence of family loyalty. The story asks whether true loyalty can survive in the face of personal gain, and how fragile these bonds are when the lure of wealth and power enters the equation. 3. Justice and the sharp intellect of Poirot. Amidst the chaos of greed and betrayal, Hercule Poirot stands as the embodiment of justice. With his unparalleled intellect, Poirot not only solves the mystery but also restores balance and order. Through careful observation and reasoning, Poirot peels away the layers of deceit, exposing the truth in a way that no one else could. His calm demeanor contrasts with the emotional turbulence around him, as he remains detached from the corruption that consumes the family. Poirot's ability to see through the lies and manipulations is a testament to the power of logic and reason, and his pursuit of justice is a reminder that, even in a world tainted by greed, the truth always has a way of revealing itself. His intellectual sharpness is not just about solving crimes, but about providing a moral compass, showing that justice, when served with integrity, can bring resolution, even if it comes at the cost of personal sacrifice. Story purpose and what it conveys. At its heart, this story serves as a reflection on human nature, how greed can tear apart even the closest relationships, how personal desires can overpower family loyalty, and how justice, when pursued with clarity and integrity, has the power to restore balance. Through the sharp intellect of Poirot, the narrative challenges us to consider how far we would go for personal gain and what price we are willing to pay for our action. The resolution brings a deeper understanding of the consequences of betrayal, showing that while personal ambition may lead to temporary success, it is loyalty, truth, and justice that ultimately triumph. This story serves not only as a gripping mystery but as a cautionary tale, reminding us that true justice and family unity come from within, not from the wealth or status that one might seek to claim at any cost.